It has been over 12 years now since my husband John and I moved into our new house together. And we hit that point that we all hit at some point or another when we're working on some major project. I'm not looking specifically at the Applegates. Just happened to glance that way and catch Priscilla's eye. But the point is, when you realize you've been working very hard for what seems like a very long time, and you've done a huge amount of work, but the amount of work left to do doesn't look any smaller than it did when you started. I overheard John on the telephone describing this phenomenon to his sister Mary, voicing his frustration at how long it seemed to be taking to get unpacked and get the house settled. And he said to her something like, "It seems like we'll never be finished." And Mary's response was, "Maybe you should let go of the idea of finished." Well, that caused us some interesting thinking as we tried to reframe the issue. We had been trying to get to some absolute point. We wanted to be finished. We wanted that sense of certainty and closure and completion so that we could finish this process and get on with real life. And what Mary pointed out is that life doesn't really run in absolutes, that we don't generally get certainty or closure or completion on lots of things, and that what we were in the middle of was real life, and we had better make the most of it. Now, I have never been crazy about ambiguity. I like things settled. I like things neatly packaged. I like to know what's what. And the trouble, of course, is that life isn't like that. Life is uncertain. Like that wonderful saying, "Life is uncertain, eat dessert first." And it reminds me of another quotation that I encountered some time ago that said, "We can despair when the rug is pulled out from under us, or we can learn how to dance on the shifting carpet." Another way to reframe things, because the carpet is always shifting. Now, for a person who likes certainty and likes to know what's what, I wound up in an unlikely faith tradition. There's an old joke that says in most religious traditions, people go to the church and to their minister to find the answers, and that in Unitarian Universalism, we come to find the questions. There's a lot of truth to that. And I've been thinking a lot about the importance of the questions and the impossibility, sometimes, of coming to absolute answers. And what sparked that thinking for me was reading an article in the Philadelphia Inquirer years ago about a guy named Jack Miles. He's the one who won the Pulitzer Prize for his book, God, a Biography. Now, in writing his book, Miles had decided that he was going to treat God, the God presented in the Bible, as a literary character. He was writing his book as a character analysis of God as presented in the Bible. So he wasn't trying to understand the relevance of the concept of God for our world today. He was looking at and trying to make sense of the God of the Jewish and Christian Bibles. That's why he called it a biography. You could also call it a character study. He's working with the Bible as a book of literature and God as the main character. So Miles analyzes what's presented in the biblical texts without even addressing the question of whether or not the stories are true, whether the Bible's picture of God is real. He's a professor of humanities. He's not a theologian. So I gather it came as something of a surprise to him to find that once he had written a book about God, people began to assume he was an expert in any kind of religious area, belief, prayer, and people kept asking him what he believed about God, whether or not he believed in God. Miles tried to avoid the question for a long time. When that became impossible, he finally characterized himself as a pious agnostic. Now, Jack Miles is a church-going Episcopalian, but he has a refreshing perspective on why he goes to church. He says, it's not the saving knowledge that I find there, but the admission I make there as nowhere else that no knowledge saves. It's not the saving knowledge that I find there in church, but the admission I make there as nowhere else that no knowledge saves. And then he went on to suggest that we try putting love of neighbor ahead of purity of belief. What a radical thought. Miles argues that Christianity, as well as other religions, need to make more room for agnosticism, the belief that it is impossible for us to know whether or not there is a God. He says, and I love this phrase, that we need a certain meekness about the human mind and its limits. In the midst of a culture focused on certainty, he argues the value of uncertainty. Well, certainly there are congregations where a message like that would be shocking, but I think you all know that this isn't one of them. Theological certainty has never been lifted up as being all that desirable among Unitarian Universalists. On the other hand, meekly admitting the limitations of the human mind has never been our strong suit either. As I sat with that phrase, pious agnostic, and I thought about Jack Miles's comments, I began to get a clearer sense of my own theology and a better understanding of some of my frustration as I try to find my place in the religious world. And I'm coming to really like that word agnostic, because it implies a certain humility and an open mind. Now, for those of you who didn't read it in the newsletter, this sermon was first written and preached over 12 years ago. I brought it here as a guest preacher shortly after I had written it, and several of you remembered it and asked me to bring it back. And I'm struck by how relevant it still feels to my own religious development. Usually a sermon I had written and first preached 12 years ago would not be something I could use anymore because I'm not the person I was then. And now I'm much more comfortable with theological language. I'm more likely to say that, yes, I do believe in God, even though I don't know what that means, as opposed to saying I don't know if I believe in God or not. But it's fun to realize that even with the changes, there's all these core assumptions that have not changed for me. I need that reminder to humility and an open mind, because it's not only the religious traditionalists who have a tendency to be closed-minded. As I read some Unitarian or Unitarian Universalist writers, I'm struck by our potential to be somewhat fundamentalist about our rationalism.